So imagine a constitution, right, that doesn't start with, well, a list of your human rights.
Right.
Imagine a socio-economic blueprint, like the very foundational DNA of a society that completely skips guaranteeing freedom of speech or the right to assemble or, bearing
Skips
arms.
all the usual stuff.
Exactly. Instead, imagine a legal framework that opens by systematically, just aggressively, stripping away the very concept of absolute human ownership.
Yeah, which is it's a profoundly jarring way to conceptualize the beginning of any legal code.
Right, because we're so used to the opposite.
Exactly. The premise here is stark. It's basically saying you are not the owner, I am not the owner.
Nobody is.
No corporation, no king, no sovereign wealth fund, and definitely no elite class actually owns the ground they stand on, or the water they drink, or the capital they hoard.
Which is wild.
It is. That is a massive radical departure from almost every modern legal framework we have. Because traditionally, constitutions are designed, first and foremost, to protect the property of the people who already possess it.
Protect the stuff of the people who wrote the Constitution.
Exactly.
And that radical departure is exactly where we are dropping you in today. We're going to look at what I can really only call a masterclass in socioeconomic deconstruction.
It really is a masterclass.
So the source material for this deep dive is a lecture delivered back in February 1980 by the Islamic philosopher and scholar Allama Parvez.
Right.
Specifically, we are examining his intensely analytical breakdown of the opening 5 verses of Surah Saba, which is the 34th chapter of the Quran.
And we really need to establish some crucial context for you right up front about who Allama Parvez was and how he approached text.
Yeah, that's important.
Because he was a really prominent figure in 20th century Islamic rationalism. I mean, he lived through the partition of India, the creation of Pakistan, and just these massive socio-economic upheavals during the Cold War era.
A lot of transition, a lot of chaos.
So much chaos. And his entire methodology was about stripping away centuries of mystical or purely devotional or just culturally inherited interpretations of the Quran.
He wasn't looking at it as just, nice poetry.
Not at all. He sought to uncover what he argued was its original intent, which is a rational, mechanical, and highly pragmatic blueprint for a functional, equitable society.
Which brings us to the real mission for today's deep dive, because if you want to grasp the actual gravity of this 1980 lecture, you have to leave your conventional assumptions at the door.
You really do.
Whether you are intimately familiar with this text or you're hearing about it for the literal first time today, we are asking you to just put aside the lens of devotional poetry or theological mysticism and traditional religious rituals.
That is absolutely essential. Parvez is not reading these opening verses as some hymn to be chanted in a monastery.
Right.
He is treating this specific passage as a rigorous socio-economic preamble to a societal constitution. He argues that this is a blueprint explicitly designed to flatten power structures and completely dismantle wealth monopolies.
Now, before we really get into the weeds of how he argues this, and we are going to get into the weeds, I want to add a quick but super important disclaimer for you, the listener. Yeah, we should put this out there. The concepts we're about to unpack are heavily, heavily critical of wealth hoarding, monopolies, and elite power structures.
Extremely critical.
So to be entirely clear, we as hosts are not endorsing a specific economic teardown here, nor are we taking a political side in the modern debate between capitalism, socialism, or whatever other system.
Right, that's not our goal.
Our job today is purely to map out Parvez's radical interpretation of this text, to impartially report on the socio-economic mechanics he is proposing, and to just explore how he views the architecture of human society.
A really vital distinction. We're just acting as guides to his theoretical framework, examining the structural logic that he lays out.
Exactly.
And the logic he lays out begins with a direct assault on the concept of ownership, starting with the very first word of the chapter.
Okay, let's start right there. Because the passage opens with a phrase that is globally famous, right? Arguably one of the most repeated phrases in the world, alhamdulillah. Right. Now, the conventional standard translation you'll hear in almost any setting is simply, all praise belongs to God.
That's the standard.
Yeah. It's generally treated as a verbal affirmation. You say it when you're grateful, you say it after a good meal, you say it when you survive a close call in traffic.
Sure.
But Parvez takes a linguistic scalpel to this phrase, doesn't he? He argues it's not just about uttering words of thanks.
Oh, he completely reorients the translation based on its deepest linguistic roots.
Yeah.
So let's break it down into two parts. Hamd and the prefix lahu.
Okay, hum part first.
So conventionally, hamd is translated as praise. But in classical Arabic etymology, Parwez notes that hamd doesn't actually mean forced or obligatory flattery.
Like bowing to a king because you have to.
Right, it's not that. It describes the spontaneous, undeniable reaction you have when you witness a flawless, beautifully functioning mechanism or, a perfectly executed masterpiece.
Okay, so it's less like bowing down out of fear or duty and more like, I don't know, looking at the source code of a perfectly optimized operating system or observing the exact orbit of planets and just going, wow, the architecture here is undeniable. It just works perfectly.
Exactly. It's the recognition of systemic perfection. But the real socio-economic weight comes with the second part of the phrase, lahu.
The LEU.
Part, yes. This translates to for him or belonging to him. In legal and structural terms, this prefix establishes ultimate property rights.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Parwez argues that the verse is not merely saying, say nice things about the creator. It is declaring a hard legal reality.
Which is?
That the universal system, the divine order, inherently and exclusively owns everything in the heavens and the earth.
Literally everything. Every resource, every atom of sustenance, every ounce of capital.
Yes. The text is laying down the first axiom of his constitution. The system is the sole proprietor. And the socio-economic implication of that single axiom is staggering. Well, if all resources fundamentally and legally belong to the universal system, then the concept of absolute, unquestionable individual human ownership is rendered entirely illegitimate.
Okay, let me stop you there and push back on this a bit.
Go for it.
Because I can hear the cynic's argument forming right now in the listener's head. Philosophically, that sounds beautifully egalitarian, right? God owns everything. The universe owns everything. We are all equal.
Right. Sounds nice on paper.
But practically, what actually changes in a society's DNA when it culturally and legally accepts that no human is the absolute owner?
That's the big question.
Because if I'm a billionaire or an ancient king or just a guy with a massive amount of land, I might say, sure, the divine order owns it all in the cosmic sense, but my name is on the physical deed down here on Earth.
Yeah, I have the paperwork.
Exactly. I hold the patent, I have the private army, so I still make the rules.
Yeah.
How does a philosophical shift about cosmic ownership actually flatten a real-world power structure?
See, that is the core challenge to any theoretical system.
Mm-hmm.
But Parwez doesn't leave this in the realm of philosophy. He grounds it in legal mechanism and human psychology.
Okay, walk me through that.
If a society genuinely adopts this preamble into its legal framework, wealth fundamentally shifts from being a mechanism of absolute dominion, I own this, I rule you, to a concept of amanat.
Amanat.
Yes, which translates to a communal trust or a trusteeship.
A trusteeship, meaning you are managing it, not owning it.
Precisely. Let's look at the psychology of a billionaire or an absolute monarch to see why this actually matters. Where does their leverage come from?
From the fact that they have the money.
Right, but deeper than that. Their power, their arrogance, their ability to dictate terms to the working class, it all comes from the deep-seated belief that they are the ultimate providers.
Oh, the provider complex.
Exactly. They believe they manifested the wealth, they own the capital, and therefore the masses are fundamentally dependent on their generosity, their philanthropy, or their so-called job creation. They view themselves as the sovereign masters of the chessboard.
Right. It's the classic, I built this, it's mine, so I get to dictate the terms of your survival mentality. Like, if I want to make starvation wages, I can because it's my capital. I'm doing you a favor by hiring you.
Exactly. But if you institute a constitutional preamble that legally and culturally mandates, no, the system owns the board, the system owns the pieces, and you are merely a temporary trustee managing resources on behalf of the system.
You completely sever that arrogant provider complex.
You do.
I see what you're saying philosophically, but how does that translate into actual on-the-ground policy?
Think about it in terms of legal precedents. If a society accepts that no individual owns the Earth's resources, then you cannot have laws that allow one person to hoard millions of acres of fertile land while others starve.
Because it's not actually theirs to hoard.
Exactly. You cannot have legal structures that allow a corporation to monopolize water rights and sell them back to the public at a premium because the corporation fundamentally cannot hold the title to the water. The wealthy person ceases to be a generous lord tossing crumbs to peasants. They are legally viewed as an administrator of public resources.
And if they mess up?
If they mismanage that trust or hoard it to the detriment of society, the system has the legal and moral authority to just revoke their trusteeship.
So by establishing ultimate ownership at the universal level, it lays the groundwork for a society completely devoid of economic masters and slaves, because no human can claim the ultimate leverage over another human's basic survival.
Exactly. It removes the legal and psychological justification for exploitation.
Okay, I follow the structural logic of that. It's brilliant, but it immediately brings up the next logistical nightmare. Auditing. Let's say we establish this trust. If the system owns everything and I am just a trustee managing a factory or a farm or a global supply chain, how does the system actually track my management of those resources?
Right.
If I'm an elite trustee and I decide to quietly siphon off a little extra for my private offshore accounts, or I exploit the workers but I'm really good at hiding the paperwork, who is auditing me?
Because people are sneaky.
Very. Human history is basically just a long, continuous list of people finding loopholes in regulations.
That is the exact vulnerability Parwes addresses next by moving to the second verse of the chapter. And this is where his analysis takes what looks like a purely mystical concept and translates it into a fascinating exploration of human psychology.
Okay, I love this part.
To address the audit problem, the text introduces the concept of the kitab-i-mubin.
The kitab-i-mubin, the clear register or the manifest ledger.
Correct. The passage insists that the universal system is acutely aware of everything that enters the earth and everything that emerges from it. It explicitly states that not an atom's weight escapes this record.
An atom's weight?
Not in the heavens, not in the earth, smaller or larger, all of it. Every single action, motive, and transaction is tracked in this kitab-i-mubin.
Now, traditionally, when people hear about a divine ledger that tracks every atom of a person's deeds, they imagine it as some kind of magical external archive, right?
Yes, very literal.
Like literal angels sitting on your shoulders with feather pens, writing down your good and bad deeds in a giant golden book in the sky. It's a very anthropomorphic view of auditing.
Very medieval painting kind of imagery.
Yeah. But Parwes says, no. Put away the imagery of golden books and look closer at yourselves. He maps this clear register directly to human biology and the unconscious mind.
This is one of his most profound contributions. Parwes points out that in other parts of the Quran, this ledger is described as being fastened to a person's own neck.
Oh, wow. Fastened to their neck.
Yeah. It is not sitting in a celestial filing cabinet. It is biologically and psychologically attached to the individual. Parwes connects this ancient imagery directly to the reality of the conscious versus the unconscious mind.
He uses some specific Arabic terms for this, right?
He does. He uses the terms nafsi shuuri and nasikir shuuri.
Okay, let's define those carefully for the listener. Nafsi shuuri is the conscious self.
Right.
Like the part of me that is talking to you right now, making active decisions, justifying my actions.
Right.
And nafsi shuuri is the unconscious self.
Yes. And as modern psychology tells us, the conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. It is a tiny, tiny fraction of our mental real estate.
Just a drop in the bucket.
Right. The unconscious mind, the nafsi shuuri, is the vast, hidden storage facility. It processes and records everything. Parwes argues that the kitab-i-mubin, the clear ledger, is essentially your own psychological hard drive.
So if an elite trustee exploits a worker, or if someone quietly embezzles money, they might forge the external paperwork. They might lie to the public. They might even lie to themselves.
You usually do.
But every hidden motive, every act of exploitation, every fractional compromise of their integrity, it doesn't just vanish into the ether. It is recorded immutably in their own unconscious mind.
Perfectly recorded.
The text even mentions the system knowing the betrayal of the eyes.
Exactly. Let's contrast this internal psychological ledger with our modern reality of power and accountability.
Please do.
In our world, the powerful act without audit because they control the external ledgers.
Yes, they own the auditors.
Right. If a massive corporation commits an environmental crime, they can burn the paper trails, they can delete the emails, they can tie up regulators in court for literal decades, or they can simply bribe the politicians who oversee them.
And they get away with it.
They operate with total impunity because the record is external, and the external record can be manipulated.
They literally write the history books. They control the narrative.
They do.
Yeah.
But Parwes is outlining a societal constitution based on total, inescapable accountability. You cannot bribe your own unconscious mind.
Wow.
You cannot shred the files in your own nafsi shuuri. The oppressor's conscious mind, the nafs-e-shuri, will do everything in its power to justify the crime.
Right, they tell themselves a story.
Exactly. It will invent narratives of racial superiority or economic necessity or, survival of the fittest to suppress the guilt. But the unconscious mind records the raw, objective truth of the exploitation.
I want to play devil's advocate here, though, because I think there's a big loophole here. What about the concept of a sociopath? What about a ruthless dictator or a corrupt CEO who genuinely feels zero guilt? Their conscious mind doesn't seem to be battling their unconscious mind at all. They sleep perfectly fine at night.
Right. They don't care.
Does this psychological ledger concept fall apart if the person is just biologically wired to not care?
That is a fantastic pushback, and it really gets to the heart of what Parwes means by the record. Parwes is not equating the ledger merely to the subjective feeling of guilt.
He's not.
No. Guilt is an emotion, and emotions can indeed be suppressed or absent. The ledger is about the objective accumulation of contradictions and the cognitive load placed on the human psyche.
Cognitive load.
Yes. Even if a sociopath feels no subjective remorse, their psyche is still recording the objective reality that they are functioning in opposition to the systemic laws of equity and balance. They are accumulating psychological debt.
Oh, I see. It's like a computer running a corrupted program in the background. The user might not notice the error messages right away. They might just keep forcing the program to run, but the corrupted data is still writing to the hard drive, sector by sector.
Precisely. The system is recording the friction, and Parwes argues that this friction cannot be sustained forever.
It has to crash.
It has to. The text talks about the hour, the moment of consequence, when the system demands an audit. When that time arrives, whether on a societal level or an individual level, Parwes says it is your own psychology that forces the ledger open.
He paints this incredible, almost terrifying picture of these two parts of the mind clashing. The conscious mind is fighting desperately to keep the ledger rolled up, to keep the corruption hidden in the dark.
Fighting for its life.
But the text says that on the day of consequence, the book is unrolled and the individual is confronted with it. The text literally says, and this is chilling, read your own book. You are sufficient as your own auditor today.
It's a profound psychological burden. It means the oppressor is eventually destroyed from the inside out. But you don't need a divine judge sitting on a throne pointing a finger.
You don't need a jury.
You don't need an external jury of peers to reach a verdict. The individual is forced by their own biology, their own accumulated psychological data, to confront the unvarnished reality of their actions.
I just want you, the listener, to pause and imagine the sheer terror of that for a corrupt elite class.
It's staggering.
Imagine a class of people who have spent their entire lives buying off judges, manipulating the media, silencing whistleblowers, suddenly realizing that their own internal psychology is the undeniable, tamper-proof evidence of their corruption.
It is the ultimate flattening of power, because the mechanism of justice is built into the very biology of the human being. No amount of hoarded capital can buy a firewall for your own unconscious mind.
Okay, that is a brilliantly tight mechanism for accountability. I love that. But human beings are incredibly inventive when it comes to avoiding accountability.
Oh, we are the best at it.
Right. If my own psychology is the ledger, and I am terrified of this inevitable audit, what's my next move? Historically, my next move is to find a middleman.
The loophole of the intermediary.
Exactly. I go find someone who claims they can fix the ledger for me. I find a priest, a guru, a shaman, or a spiritual guide who says, hey, don't worry. I speak for the universal system. I have access to the unseen.
I know the guy.
I know the guy. Pay me a tithe, offer this sacrifice, perform this ritual, and I will cleanse your unconscious mind. I'll put in a good word for you with the divine and will wipe the ledger clean before the audit.
And right there, you were describing the birth of the priesthood class, the gatekeepers of the unseen.
Yes. And this is where Parwes' analysis of the third verse just absolutely violently kicks the door closed on that entire industry.
It really does.
The text addresses those who say the hour will not come to us, or who try to predict or manipulate the future. And the verse explicitly states that the knowledge of the unseen, the Arabic term is kaib, and the exact timing of the hour of consequence, rests strictly and exclusively with the divine order.
Not with any human.
Zero humans.
And we really need to sit with the sociological deduction Parwes makes here. Because traditional commentary looks at this verse and says, see, God knows everything and we don't. It's a theological statement about divine omniscience.
It's just a fact about God.
Right. But Parwes approaches it as a socio-economic structural mandate.
How so?
By explicitly declaring that the gaib, the unseen, is entirely off-limits to humans, you completely strip self-appointed intermediaries of any claim to privileged access.
This is a massive power grab back from the spiritual elite.
Utterly massive. I mean, think about the power dynamics in ancient civilizations. Egypt, Babylon, medieval Europe.
The pharaohs and the popes.
Right. The kings and the wealthy elite held the physical capital. But the priesthood held the psychological capital. The priest could claim to read the stars, interpret dreams, or speak to the gods.
Which is ultimate leverage.
Because they monopolized the unseen, they could control the masses through fear. They could legitimize a corrupt king by saying the gods willed it.
The gods are angry, so give us 10% of your harvest and we'll calm them down.
Precisely. They created an artificial economy based entirely on fear of the unknown. Soothsayers, fortune tellers, astrologers, and the entire institutionalized priesthood class, they all rely on the claim that they have a VIP pass to the gaib.
And Parwes is saying the Constitution bans VIP passes.
Parwes argues that this constitutional framework renders them entirely obsolete. If no human has access to the unseen, then no human can charge a toll on the bridge to salvation. You cannot sell indulgences.
If the system explicitly says nobody on Earth has the key to this toll booth, then the toll booth loses all its power. You can just walk right past it.
Exactly. But Parwes doesn't just stop at criticizing the exploitative priesthood.
He goes further.
He goes a step further and critiques even the well-meaning spiritual elites, the mystics.
Oh, this is fascinating.
This raises an incredibly important question about the difference between personal spiritual elitism and actual societal change. To illustrate this, Parwes draws a very sharp distinction, and he uses a brilliant historical contrast.
Yes.
He quotes the renowned 20th century philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, who in turn was reflecting on a quote by a highly revered Sufi mystic from the 15th century, Abdul Qadir Gangohi.
Oh, this is hands down one of my favorite parts of the whole lecture. It is such a mic drop moment for understanding the difference between religion as just a personal feeling and religion as a societal structure. Set this up for us.
Okay, so Abdul Qadir Gangohi, this deeply devoted Sufi mystic, is reflecting on the ultimate spiritual event in Islamic tradition, the Prophet's ascension.
The journey to the heavens.
Right, the journey to the ultimate spiritual heights, the direct encounter with the divine. And Gangohi, writing from his perspective as a medic who basically spends his whole life trying to achieve just a fraction of that spiritual ecstasy, says this about the Prophet's return to earth. He says, "By God, if I had reached that peak, I would never have returned."
It's a stunning admission. It's so painfully honest. If I had experienced that level of peace, that level of ultimate reality, I would never have come back down to this messy, miserable planet.
It is honest, and Parwes uses it to highlight the fundamental, irreconcilable difference between a mystic and a revolutionary messenger.
Okay, break that down.
A mystic's ultimate goal is to reach a spiritual high. They want to experience this profound, intoxicating connection with the divine, and they want to stay there. It's a state of permanent isolation.
Right. They retreat to the cave or the monastery in the mountains or the ashram. They've found their inner peace. They are meditating. They are serene. They are done with the world.
But look at what they are actually offering to the world.
Yeah.
It is an individualistic, almost selfish pursuit of ecstasy.
They're just saving themselves.
Exactly. They want to remain in the unseen. They are offering absolutely nothing to the humanity down below in the valley who are starving, who are being exploited by landlords, who are being crushed by the system. The mystic escapes the societal machinery. They don't fix it.
And Parwes contrasts that directly with the role of a messenger operating within this constitutional framework.
Yes.
A messenger might experience that ultimate spiritual high, but their explicit, defining duty is to return. They have to return to the mud.
Back to the mess.
Back to the conflict, the politics, the socio-economic reality. Their job is to break the exploitative status quo and build a new society based on equitable laws.
The mystic wants to escape reality. The revolutionary messenger wants to reshape it. And Parwes reinforces this dynamic by completely redefining how we traditionally understand certain titles given to the prophet in the Quran. He looks at words like Muzammil and Mudathir.
Yes. Let's break those down, because the traditional translations of those words always confuse me.
They're very odd translations, usually.
Right. Usually, if you read a standard English translation, Muzammil and Mudathir are translated as the one wrapped in a blanket, or the one wearing a cloak.
Right.
It paints this picture of someone who is passive, maybe shivering, hiding from the world in a blanket. It sounds very much like the fragile ascetic mystic we were just talking about.
which completely contradicts the revolutionary, deeply active nature of the mission. Parwez argues that translating those terms as a guy in a blanket is just a massive failure to understand classical Arabic idioms.
So what do they actually mean?
He digs into the linguistic roots.
Yeah.
He argues that Muzamil actually refers to a caravan leader,
A caravan leader.
specifically a leader who carefully selects their companions and intricately balances the weights on the camels to ensure the journey doesn't falter.
Oh, wow. So it's a metaphor for organization. It's about building a highly effective vanguard, assembling a political and social movement that can bear the weight of actual societal transformation. It's logistics, not a blanket.
Precisely. And Mudathir is even more profound. Parwez points out that in ancient Arabic poetry, the root of this word does not just mean covering up. It refers to the one who brings the spring to a dead, winter-struck world.
The bringer of spring to a dead garden.
Yes, it is an inherently active, dynamic title.
Stand up and mourn. Stand up and break the winter of this exploitative system. Bring the spring of equity. It completely transforms the text from a passive mystical observation into an explosive call to action.
But, and this is a big grimmer, but that call to action, that dynamism, requires an immense amount of patience.
Which people are bad at.
Very bad at. And this is perhaps the hardest part for any social movement to grapple with. If there are no magical interventions, if there are no priests to mediate, and if the mystic's escape is rejected, how does the system actually dispense justice in the real world?
Right, logistically.
This leads us directly to the fourth critical piece of Parwez's constitutional preamble, the mechanism of reward and consequence.
Right, because if I'm a listener or if I'm a citizen in this proposed society, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, the system owns everything, my unconscious mind is recording everything, and the priests can't save me. But the corrupt elite are still in power right now.
They're still winning.
They are still winning.
Yeah.
But the text frames the hour, the moment of consequence, not as an arbitrary, terrifying doom brought by a moody, vengeful deity who just decides to strike lightning down one day, but as the inevitable mathematical output of a moral machine.
It is a lawful consequence. And to help us understand this mechanism, Parwez uses an analogy that I think is incredibly grounding. He uses the analogy of a farmer.
It's the perfect analogy for understanding systemic law versus arbitrary miracles.
Oh, it really is.
Walk us through the farmer analogy.
Think about what a farmer actually does. A farmer takes perfectly good, valuable grain that he could grind up and eat that very day to satisfy his immediate hunger.
Right, it's food. He could just eat it.
Exactly. And instead, he goes out and throws it into the dirt.
Which seems insane.
If an alien came down and observed him, they would think he was out of his mind, throwing his food in the dirt. And then he works. He toils in the heat, he pulls weeds, he waters the soil, day after day, week after week.
For free?
Right. He doesn't get a single day's pay, he doesn't get an immediate return on his labor, so why does he do it?
Because he trusts the mechanical, inevitable law of the harvest. He knows that he isn't relying on a miracle, he is relying on biology.
Exactly.
He knows that if he follows the process, the biology of the seed, the chemistry of the earth, and the energy of the sun will mathematically multiply his investment. He is trusting the system's delayed output.
Exactly. Social justice, in Parwez's framework, operates on the exact same delayed but absolutely certain mechanism. The results of our actions, whether we are building up society through equity or exploiting it through corruption, take time to manifest.
It's not instantaneous.
No. Parwez introduces a crucial Arabic term here, molat.
Molat, which means a delay or a period of respite.
Yes. The system gives oppressors molat. It gives them a delay. It doesn't instantly strike a CEO down with a heart attack the very first time they underpay a worker.
Or sink a pirate ship the moment it steals cargo.
Exactly.
But I have to jump in here because that delay, that molat, is exactly where human beings lose their minds.
Oh, it drives us crazy.
That delay is the source of so much existential frustration. People look at the world today, they look at the wealth inequality, they look at warlords and corrupt politicians, and they say, if the system is so perfectly balanced, if the universe is running on this flawless moral architecture, why are the corrupt billionaires living in mega mansions while good, hardworking people are starving?
Where is the justice?
Where is it? The delay just looks like systemic failure to us.
That is the ultimate human impatience, and honestly, it's a completely understandable frustration. We want the instant audit. We want instant karma. But Parwez argues that this delay, this molat, is actually a function of the system's resilience and its overarching bias toward what he calls care, which means ultimate, enduring good.
Okay, but how does letting an oppressor succeed for a while equal enduring good? That feels counterintuitive.
Because the delay allows for the possibility of course correction.
Ah,
A
okay.
system that instantly executes anyone who makes a mistake is a brittle, terrifying system.
Hmm.
The delay allows humanity the space to recognize their errors and realign with the system.
But what if they don't?
If the oppressor refuses to self-correct, the delay serves a second purpose: accumulation. The destructive actions pile up. The psychological debt we talked about in the unconscious mind piles up. The societal inequality reaches a boiling point.
The pressure builds.
Exactly. There's a cumulative effect. The weight of the corruption builds until it structurally cannot support itself, and the oppressive system collapses under the weight of its own systemic failure.
Parwes tells this amazing personal story in the lecture to illustrate how things that look like pure evil or pure systemic failure in the short term are actually part of a larger mechanism of good.
The snake venom story.
Yes. He shares an anecdote about a time he was incredibly ill. He had undergone surgery and he was at death's door. The infection was rampant. The doctors had essentially given up. They told his family to prepare for the worst.
Right.
And finally, a doctor decided to administer one last highly specialized injection. And it saved his life. It broke the fever, killed the infection, brought him back from the break. And when Parwes asked the doctor later what was in the injection, the doctor told him it was a medicine derived directly from snake venom.
It is such a visceral, profound example. Because if you look at a venomous snake in isolation, if you just look at the fangs and the poison, you think, this is pure evil. This substance only causes agonizing death. Why would a perfect, mathematically sound universal system create this?
Right. It feels like a glitch in the goodness of the universe.
But Parwes argues that is a short-term, uneducated perspective. When you understand the broader biochemical mechanism, when you zoom out and look at the pharmacology, that exact substance, the venom, can be synthesized to become the literal key to saving a human life in a medical emergency.
He uses the ocean as another example of this, which I think is even easier to visualize. He says, look at the ocean. It covers 3/4 of the planet. But if you are dying of thirst on a life raft and you drink it, the salt and the minerals will literally shut down your kidneys and kill you.
You'll die faster.
Exactly. From the perspective of the thirsty man, the ocean looks like a giant, cruel reservoir of death. It seems totally useless for sustaining life.
But again, that is the limited perspective. The system has a massive free distillation plant running constantly, the sun. The sun's heat evaporates the water, leaving the deadly salt and minerals behind, and the atmospheric winds carry that evaporated moisture across the continents, dropping it as pure, life-giving rain exactly where the soil needs it.
It's a huge machine.
It is. The apparent evil or uselessness of the salt water is actually the raw material for the ultimate good of the rain. The system requires the vast, salty ocean to create the fresh water.
So if we apply that ocean analogy or the snake venom analogy to human society and this concept of molat, the delay in justice,
Yes.
the temporary dominance of exploitative forces, the eras of history where tyrants seem to win, might seem like a permanent failure of justice. But the constitutional law of requital is constantly running in the background. The distillation process of history is evaporating the truth from the lies. The consequences are accumulating, even if we can't see the rain clouds forming yet.
Exactly. The moral machine never stops running. And this brings us to the ultimate output of this moral machine for those who align with it.
The final result.
Yes. When a society actually adopts this preamble, when they reject absolute ownership, when they embrace accountability, when they banish the intermediaries, and when they trust the systemic laws, what is the socio-economic result? The text calls it rizq-e-karim.
Rizq-e-karim, which translates roughly to honorable provision or generous sustenance. But again, Parwes doesn't let us get away with this simple, surface-level translation.
No, he doesn't do simple.
This isn't just about making sure everyone gets a bowl of soup and enough calories to survive the winter.
Not at all. And we really need to spend some time here because Parwes expands on rizq-e-karim in a way that completely indicts our modern understanding of charity and welfare.
Oh, yeah.
Rizq-e-karim is the absolute fundamental antithesis of the traditional charitable model.
Break that down. What is wrong with the traditional charitable model? Because we are taught that charity is the ultimate virtue. Giving to the poor is universally praised in almost every culture.
Charity is praised in a broken system. But analyze the psychology of traditional charity for a second.
Okay.
In a charitable model, there is always an inherent hierarchy. Think about a billionaire opening a soup kitchen or donating millions to a hospital wing. The giver, whether they admit it or not, feels a sense of superiority.
Sure, they're the savior.
They're the benevolent savior. They are dispensing their wealth out of the goodness of their heart. And the receiver, the person standing in the breadline, the person applying for the welfare grant, no matter how politely they are treated, inherently feels a sense of shame.
They feel lower.
They feel a sense of dependence. They are submissive. It creates a psychological dynamic of the upper hand and the lower hand.
I see. The very act of charity reinforces the power dynamic. The poor person is forced to look down at their shoes, say thank you, and rely on the mood of the rich person. If the rich person wakes up angry tomorrow and closes the soup kitchen, the poor person starves. That is profound dependence.
Yes, and Parwes argues that any system, any economy, any society that requires one human being to lower their gaze in submission to another human being for their basic survival is fundamentally broken.
It's a failure.
It is a violation of human dignity. Rizq-e-Karim, on the other hand, is an economic system where sustenance is not a gift. It is a systemic right.
It sounds almost like a modern argument for universal basic income, but elevated to a constitutional, almost cosmic mandate of dignity.
It is very similar in a structural goal, though Parwes roots it in the preamble we've been discussing. Remember step 1.
The system owns everything.
Exactly. The wealth is a trust. Therefore, when a citizen goes to the centralized system to receive what they need for their family, they feel absolutely zero shame in taking it.
Because it's theirs.
Right. They aren't begging. They are claiming their rightful share of the universe's resources, guaranteed to them by the Constitution.
And crucially, whoever is sitting on the other side of the desk, the administrator distributing the resources, feels zero superiority because they aren't giving away their own money.
They're just a clerk.
They are just a clerk managing the system's wealth. There is no benevolent savior complex.
It is the institutionalization of pure human dignity. It removes the psychological violence of poverty. Parwes quotes a beautiful Persian line of poetry to summarize the entire objective of this Islamic socio-economic framework.
What's the line?
He says, Kas nagardat dar jahan mutashkas, which translates to, no person in the world should be dependent on another person.
No person should be dependent on another person. That is an incredibly high bar.
It is the only metric that matters in Parwes' reading. That is the ultimate KPI, key performance indicator of a society. If any element of your society makes a human dependent on another's whims, it fails the test.
So, if your labor laws force a worker to endure abuse because they are dependent on the employer for health insurance, your society has failed. If your tax codes allow the hoarding of wealth while others rely on GoFundMe campaigns to afford insulin, your society has failed.
Absolutely.
If your welfare systems force a single mother to jump through humiliating bureaucratic hoops to prove she is, quote-unquote, poor enough to deserve food, your system is fundamentally at odds with this preamble.
Completely at odds. Rizq-e-Karim demands a system where provision is honorable, seamless, and completely devoid of human subjugation.
Okay. Let's take a breath and bring all of this massive interconnected architecture together. Because we started by looking at 5 short verses from the opening of Surah Saba.
Just 5 verses.
Verses that most people breeze past as standard devotional praise. But when you synthesize Parwes' rationalist breakdown, the logic is incredibly tight and sequential.
It functions flawlessly as a constitutional preamble. Let's review the steps.
Step 1. Establish ultimate ownership. Hamd and lahu. The system owns everything. This legally destroys the elite's claim to absolute property and institutes a universal trusteeship.
Right.
Step 2, implement inescapable accountability, the kitab-e-mubin. You establish a psychological, biological ledger where the unconscious mind tracks every atom of exploitation, ensuring no one can forge the audit.
Step 3.
Step 3, eradicate the gatekeepers, the gaib. You declare the unseen and the future totally inaccessible to human beings, instantly rendering the entire industry of priests, fortune tellers, and spiritual middlemen obsolete.
Gone.
Step 4, trust the moral machine, molat. You rely on a mechanical, farmer-like law of requital that guarantees delayed but mathematically certain consequences for both oppressors and builders.
And the final step.
And step 5, the ultimate goal, Rizq-e-Karim. You culminate all these laws into an economic model of pure human dignity where sustenance is a right, not a charitable favor, and no human is ever forced to bow to another for survival.
It is a brilliantly cohesive framework. And what's crucial to understand about this specific chapter of the Quran, Surah Saba, is what happens next.
Oh, right. The rest of the chapter.
Parwes points out that immediately following this 5-verse preamble, The chapter goes on to use this exact framework as a measuring stick. It literally tests real historical civilizations, specifically the civilization of David and Solomon, and the civilization of the people of Saba against these exact rules.
It's like presenting the scientific formula and then showing the lab results of civilizations that tried to run the formula.
Exactly. It demands that we look at the rise and fall of nations, not as romantic myths, not as the random luck of geography, and certainly not as arbitrary divine favoritism. It frames the collapse of civilizations as the rational mathematical outputs of whether or not they adhered to these systemic laws of equity, resource management, and human dignity.
Which means it demands that we look at our own power structures rationally, not romantically. We have to strip away the myths we tell ourselves today.
And we tell ourselves a lot of myths.
We tell ourselves myths about why the rich are rich. Oh, they work harder. They are innovators. We tell ourselves myths about why the poor are poor. They are lazy. They make bad choices. Parwez's analysis demands that we drop the myths and audit the actual mechanics of our society against this preamble.
And that leads us to a deeply uncomfortable but absolutely necessary final thought for you, the listener, to take away.
Lay it on us.
We've spent this time unpacking a radical 1980 lecture that outlines a blueprint for total systemic accountability and absolute human dignity. So I want you to look around at the world today. Look at our modern global economic systems.
Really, look at them.
Look at Wall Street. Look at the massive tech monopolies. Look at our political institutions. And look at the global supply chains that rely on sweatshop labor.
Hold them up against the Kitabi Mubin and Rizki Karim.
Precisely. If our modern world were suddenly forced to adopt this exact constitutional preamble tomorrow, a framework where absolutely zero financial actions can escape an internal psychological audit, where no corporation or billionaire can claim ultimate sovereign ownership of the Earth's resources, and where every single citizen on the planet must be provided for without a single shred of humiliation, charity, or dependence.
It's a staggering thought experiment.
Ask yourself.
Yeah.
Would a single one of our current political or corporate institutions survive the transition?